Before the World Wars, there was another war that tore Europe apart for 30 long years, killing millions of people. Yet today, most people barely know it happened. When we think of wars that changed the face of Europe, our minds immediately go to the First and Second World Wars. These conflicts dominate our history books, our films, and our collective memory. They're the wars we are taught to remember because their devastation was global and their outcomes reshaped the modern age. But what if I told you that centuries before, there was another war, one so brutal, so destructive, that entire regions were wiped out? And whole populations vanished. This was not fought over a single assassination or a surprise invasion, but over faith, politics, and power. And though it is often forgotten, it laid the foundations for the Europe we know today. This is the story of the 30 Years' War, a conflict that raged from 1618 to 1648 across the heart of the European continent. It was not just one war, but a series of overlapping struggles, civil wars, dynastic wars, and even wars of religion, all tangled together into a single, unrelenting nightmare. Unlike the modern wars of the 20th century, this was not simply nation against nation. This was emperor against princes, Catholics against Protestants, dynasties against dynasties. What began as a dispute in the Holy Roman Empire spiraled into one of the deadliest wars in human history. To put its impact into perspective, historians estimate that between 6 and 8 million people perished during those 3 decades, a staggering toll for the 17th century, when Europe's population was far smaller than today. In some regions of Germany, up to 40% of the population was lost. Cities crumbled, villages were burned, and vast stretches of farmland were left barren. For the people who lived through it, the 30 Years' War felt like the end of civilization itself. Yet, centuries later, this catastrophe is rarely remembered outside of academic circles. So why is it forgotten? Perhaps because it doesn't fit neatly into a single narrative. Unlike the Second World War, which has clear villains and heroes, the 30 Years' War was a chaotic web of shifting alliances. Catholic France would eventually fight alongside Protestant forces against Catholic Spain and Austria. Protestant Sweden invaded the empire but received money from Catholic rulers. Everyone was fighting everyone, and the lines between friend and foe were constantly redrawn. This complexity makes the war harder to tell in simple stories, but that doesn't make it any less important. In fact, the 30 Years' War changed Europe forever. It not only altered borders and destroyed dynasties, but it also gave rise to the modern concept of the sovereign nation-state. The peace that ended the war, known as the Peace of Westphalia, introduced the principle that each state had the right to govern itself without interference from outside powers. This idea, born out of unimaginable bloodshed, still shapes the way our world operates today. So, as we step into this forgotten chapter of history, remember this: not all world-changing wars are remembered. And sometimes, the most transformative ones are the very battles we've allowed to slip into the shadows of memory. This is the forgotten war that changed Europe. To understand how the 30 Years' War began, we need to travel back to the early 1600s, a time when Europe looked very different from the continent we know today. The center of this story is the Holy Roman Empire, not a unified country, but a patchwork of more than 300 semi-independent states. Some were large kingdoms, others tiny principalities, bishoprics, and free cities. Each had its own rulers, armies, and loyalties, yet all were nominally under the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. In practice, however, the emperor's power was weak. He was less a ruler of a nation and more a referee trying to hold together a fractured and unstable coalition. This fragmentation meant that Europe was like a dry forest, waiting for a spark. For decades, religious divisions had deepened the cracks between these states. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, led by figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, had shattered the dominance of the Catholic Church across Europe. In many German states, princes and their people had converted to Lutheranism or Calvinism, while others remained loyal to Catholicism. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 attempted to bring stability by declaring that each ruler could decide the religion of his own territory, cuius regio, eius religio, meaning whose realm, his religion. But this so-called peace created more problems than it solved. What if a ruler changed his religion? What if his subjects refused to follow? And what about Calvinists, who weren't even recognized under the settlement? The Holy Roman Empire became a fault line of religious tension, with Protestants and Catholics suspicious of one another, arming themselves and forming alliances for their own protection. Looming over this unstable situation was the Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful royal families in Europe. From their bases in Austria and Spain, the Habsburgs ruled vast territories including Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, and parts of Italy, and they also held the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburg emperors were staunch Catholics, determined to defend and even expand Catholic power within the empire. For Protestants, this was a nightmare scenario. They feared that the Habsburgs would crush their religious freedoms and restore Catholic dominance by force. By the early 17th century, the empire had split into two armed camps. On one side stood the Catholic League, formed in 1609 under the leadership of Bavaria and backed by the emperor. On the other side was the Protestant Union, led by Protestant princes who were determined to resist Catholic pressure. Europe was already a battlefield of ideology and faith. It was only a matter of time before one small spark ignited a full-scale war. That spark came in Bohemia, a kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire located in what is now the Czech Republic. Bohemia was religiously divided. While the majority of the nobility and townspeople leaned Protestant, the ruling dynasty, the Habsburgs, remained firmly Catholic. When Emperor Matthias of the Habsburg family tried to secure his cousin Ferdinand, a devout Catholic, as the next king of Bohemia, Protestant nobles feared for their future. Ferdinand was not just a Catholic. He was a zealous counter-reformer who believed that Protestantism should be stamped out. Tensions reached a breaking point in May 1618 in an event that became legendary, the Defenestration of Prague. In Prague Castle, a group of furious Protestant nobles confronted two imperial governors who represented the Catholic Habsburgs. Heated words were exchanged, tempers flared, and in a moment that has echoed through history, the Protestants grabbed the officials and threw them out of a third-story window. Remarkably, the governors survived the fall, landing in a pile of manure in the moat below. Catholics later claimed it was angels who saved them, while Protestants sneered that it was nothing more than luck and filth. But regardless of how they landed, the act itself was explosive. Throwing out imperial representatives was not just defiance, it was open rebellion. The Protestant nobles of Bohemia declared that they would no longer recognize Ferdinand as their king, and instead offered the crown to Frederick V, a Protestant ruler from the Palatinate in Germany. This bold move was more than a local dispute. It was a direct challenge to Habsburg authority. The Habsburgs, of course, could not let such defiance stand. What started as a rebellion in Bohemia quickly drew in allies and enemies on all sides. The Catholic League rallied to the emperor's cause. Protestant states began mobilizing. Other European powers, watching from the sidelines, saw opportunity in the chaos. What had begun with a single act of defiance in Prague escalated into a massive confrontation, spreading across the empire and soon beyond its borders. Why did this one event spiral so far out of control? The answer lies in the fragile state of Europe itself. The religious divide was already a chasm. The political structure of the empire was unstable, and the ambitions of powerful dynasties like the Habsburgs meant that every local conflict carried continental weight. The Defenestration of Prague was like striking a match in a room filled with gunpowder. The explosion was inevitable. Within months, the 30 Years' War had begun. At first, it seemed like a struggle for the future of Bohemia, but as the years passed, it became clear that this was no mere local rebellion. The war would engulf Germany, drag in Denmark, Sweden, France, and Spain, and leave an indelible scar across the continent. The seeds had been planted, seeds of religious intolerance, political ambition, and dynastic rivalry. And from those seeds grew one of the deadliest wars in European history, a war that would not only devastate entire regions but also give birth to a new Europe, reshaped forever by the flames of conflict. The Defenestration of Prague in 1618 had set Europe on fire. What began as a rebellion in one kingdom quickly hardened into open warfare. The Bohemian nobility, determined to resist Catholic domination, had thrown down the gauntlet to the most powerful dynasty in Europe, the Habsburgs. What followed was the first phase of the 30 Years' War, centered in Bohemia, and it revealed just how fragile the balance of power in Europe truly was. At first, the Bohemians believed they had the upper hand. In August 1619, they formally deposed Ferdinand II, the Habsburg emperor-to-be, and elected a new king, Frederick V of the Palatinate. Frederick was a Protestant prince from the Rhineland, young, ambitious, and married to Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of King James I of England. His marriage gave the rebels hope that England, and perhaps other Protestant powers, might rally to their cause. Frederick's acceptance of the Bohemian crown sent shockwaves across Europe. For Protestants, it was a bold assertion of independence. For Catholics, it was an act of rebellion against legitimate authority. But Frederick's rise to power was brief, so brief that history remembers him by a bitter nickname, the Winter King. He would rule in Prague for only one season before his kingdom collapsed around him. The Catholic response was swift and decisive. Ferdinand II, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in August 1619, saw the Bohemian revolt not just as a threat to his authority, but as a challenge to the very survival of Catholic rule in Central Europe. He called upon the Catholic League, a coalition of Catholic states led by Maximilian of Bavaria and commanded militarily by one of the most skilled generals of the age, Count Johann Cercles of Tilly. Tilly was a disciplined and ruthless soldier, deeply loyal to the Catholic cause, and he soon set about crushing the Protestant rebellion. In November 1620, the decisive confrontation came at the Battle of White Mountain, just outside Prague. The Protestant army, made up of poorly trained mercenaries and divided by internal disputes, faced the battle-hardened forces of the Catholic League. The clash lasted less than 2 hours. The Protestants were utterly routed. Thousands were killed, and the survivors fled in panic. Frederick, realizing his crown was lost, fled Prague with his family, earning his mocking title as the Winter King. The consequences for Bohemia were devastating. The Catholic victory at White Mountain marked the end of Bohemian independence. The Habsburgs reasserted their control with brutal force. Protestant nobles who had supported the rebellion were executed or exiled. Their lands were confiscated and handed over to Catholic loyalists. The population of Bohemia was forced to accept Catholicism, and Protestant worship was banned. Over the following decades, Bohemia was systematically re-Catholicized, wiping out the religious freedoms that had once flourished there. The Bohemian phase seemed, at first glance, to be a decisive victory for the Habsburgs and the Catholic League. They had not only crushed the rebels, but also secured one of the empire's key kingdoms. But the apparent success masked deeper problems. The harsh repression in Bohemia sent a chilling message to Protestant rulers across Europe. The emperor was determined to use military force to stamp out dissent. Far from restoring stability, the victory at White Mountain alarmed Protestant powers in neighboring states, who feared they might be next. Frederick's flight also had ripple effects. Though abandoned by his father-in-law, King James of England, his cause drew sympathy across Protestant Europe. His downfall became a rallying cry, a symbol of Catholic tyranny. Soon, other rulers, first Denmark, then Sweden, and eventually even Catholic France would enter the war, determined to challenge Habsburg supremacy. Thus, the Bohemian phase was both an ending and a beginning. For Bohemia, it marked the tragic loss of religious freedom and political independence. For the Habsburgs, it seemed like a triumph, but in reality, it set the stage for a far wider conflict. The 30 Years' War would not end in Prague. Instead, the flames kindled in Bohemia would spread across the entire continent. What began as a rebellion in one kingdom would become a pan-European struggle for faith, power, and survival. The fall of the Winter King and the Catholic victory at White Mountain had reshaped Bohemia forever, but more importantly, it had transformed a local rebellion into the opening act of Europe's most destructive war. The crushing defeat of the Bohemian rebels at White Mountain in 1620 seemed to secure Catholic and Habsburg dominance in the Holy Roman Empire. But the 30 Years' War was far from over. If anything, the harsh re-Catholicization of Bohemia alarmed Protestants across Europe. Many rulers feared that the Habsburg Emperor, Ferdinand II, would not stop with Bohemia. He would push further to extinguish Protestantism altogether. This fear set the stage for the war's second and third phases, as two powerful northern kings, first Denmark's Christian IV, then Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus, stepped onto the battlefield. Christian IV of Denmark was not only a king but also one of the wealthiest rulers in Europe. As a Lutheran monarch, he felt both a religious duty and a political opportunity to defend Protestant states in the Holy Roman Empire. In 1625, he entered the war as the self-declared protector of Protestantism, hoping to check Habsburg expansion and secure influence for Denmark. His intervention transformed the conflict from a localized rebellion into a wider European war. But Christian IV faced formidable opponents. By this time, Ferdinand II had found an unlikely champion, Albrecht von Wallenstein, a brilliant but controversial Bohemian noble. Wallenstein was no ordinary general. He was a military entrepreneur who raised his own army of tens of thousands, financed not by the emperor, but by war itself. His troops lived off the land, plundering towns and villages, which made him feared by civilians as much as by enemy soldiers. Yet, Wallenstein's discipline, ambition, and ruthless efficiency made him indispensable to the Catholic cause. Alongside Wallenstein stood Count Tilly, who had already secured victory at White Mountain. Together, these two generals formed a devastating partnership. Christian's forces, though spirited, were no match for the experience and resources of the Catholic armies. In 1626, at the Battle of Lutter, Christian suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Tilly. His army was shattered, and his prestige as Protestant leader collapsed. Wallenstein pursued him relentlessly, driving Danish forces out of much of northern Germany. By 1629, Christian was forced to sue for peace. The result was the Treaty of Lübeck, which allowed Christian to retain his Danish crown, but forced him to abandon all claims within the Holy Roman Empire. It was a humiliating retreat. For the Habsburgs, it was a moment of triumph. Protestant resistance seemed crushed, and Catholic power stretched across Central Europe stronger than ever before. But success created its own problems. Wallenstein's growing power and independence alarmed Ferdinand II, who feared his general might overshadow even the emperor himself. In a moment of political miscalculation, Ferdinand dismissed Wallenstein in 1630. That same year, a new Protestant savior arrived, one who would transform the war entirely. If Christian IV of Denmark had been bold, then Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden was nothing short of revolutionary. Known as the Lion of the North, Gustavus was not only a devout Lutheran but also one of the most brilliant military minds of the 17th century. Backed financially by Catholic France, who sought to weaken the Habsburgs regardless of religion, Gustavus landed in northern Germany in 1630, determined to rescue the Protestant cause. What set Gustavus apart was his mastery of modern warfare. At a time when armies were often clumsy masses of pikemen and musketeers, Gustavus emphasized mobility, coordination, and discipline. He pioneered the use of mobile field artillery, light cannons that could be moved quickly during battle, unleashing devastating firepower against enemy formations. His infantry fought in flexible lines rather than dense squares, allowing them to adapt swiftly to battlefield conditions. His cavalry, too, were trained to charge aggressively and retreat in formation, creating constant pressure on enemy forces. In 1631, Gustavus's innovations were put to the test at the Battle of Breitenfeld, near Leipzig. Facing Count Tilly's seasoned Catholic League army, the Swedish king orchestrated a stunning victory. For the first time, Protestant forces decisively defeated the Catholic League in open battle. Breitenfeld electrified Europe, proving that the Habsburgs were not invincible and that the Protestant cause had new life. But the war remained brutal. In 1632, at the Battle of Lutzen, Gustavus again led his army against imperial forces, this time facing his old rival Wallenstein, who had been recalled to command. The battle was fierce and bloody, and though the Swedes managed to claim victory, it came at a terrible cost. Gustavus Adolphus himself was killed in the fighting, struck down while leading a cavalry charge. His death was a devastating blow, not just to Sweden, but to all Protestant Europe. Yet, even in death, Gustavus left behind a transformed battlefield. His reforms in discipline, artillery, and tactical coordination revolutionized European warfare. The Swedish army remained a powerful force, continuing the struggle under his chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna. More importantly, Sweden's intervention shifted the very nature of the war. What had begun as a conflict over religion now became increasingly about politics and power. Catholic France was financing Protestant Sweden, not out of faith but to weaken its Habsburg rivals. The neat lines of Catholic versus Protestant blurred, replaced by a struggle for dominance between great powers. The Danish and Swedish phases of the war marked a critical turning point. Christian IV's failure demonstrated the weakness of isolated Protestant efforts, while Gustavus Adolphus's victories proved that the Habsburgs could be challenged. Together, these phases ensured that the 30 Years' War would not end quickly. Instead, it would spiral further into chaos, drawing in even more players and transforming into a full-scale contest for the balance of power in Europe. What began in Bohemia as a local revolt had, by the mid-1632s, become a continental struggle. The war was no longer just about religion, it was about survival, ambition, and control of Europe's future, and the bloodshed was far from over. The 30 Years' War entered a new stage when Christian IV of Denmark took the lead in defending Protestant states. Motivated both by religion and his own territorial ambitions in northern Germany, Christian believed he could challenge Catholic and Habsburg dominance. However, the rise of Albrecht von Wallenstein dramatically changed the course of events. Wallenstein, one of Europe's most feared and capable generals, raised a massive army for the emperor, funded through war profits rather than direct taxation. His strategy combined ruthless discipline, economic exploitation, and innovative logistics, making him a formidable force on the battlefield. The Danes suffered a series of defeats, most notably at the Battle of Lutter in 1626, where Christian's forces were crushed. Over the next years, Wallenstein and General Tilly advanced through Protestant territories, leaving Denmark weakened and isolated. By 1629, Christian was forced into the Treaty of Lubeck, which compelled him to withdraw from German politics and give up support for Protestant states. This marked a huge victory for the Catholic and Habsburg powers, giving them control across much of Central Europe. Yet, the aggressive expansion of Habsburg influence alarmed neighboring powers, paving the way for new players to enter the war. The conflict took a decisive turn when King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden entered the war. Backed financially by Catholic France, Gustavus fought not only for Protestantism, but also to secure Sweden's position as a rising European power. Gustavus introduced revolutionary military tactics, such as mobile artillery and flexible infantry formations, which gave his army greater speed and firepower. These innovations allowed him to achieve remarkable victories against seemingly stronger Catholic forces. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, the Swedish army delivered a crushing blow to the imperial forces, restoring Protestant confidence. A year later, Gustavus again triumphed at the Battle of Lutzen, though he was killed in the fighting. His death was a devastating loss for the Protestant cause, removing its most brilliant leader at a critical moment. Despite this setback, Sweden's involvement transformed the war. What began as a religious struggle now evolved into a political conflict, with Catholic France funding Protestant Sweden to weaken the Habsburgs. The war was no longer simply about faith, but about the balance of power in Europe. The Danish and Swedish phases reveal how the 30 Years' War grew beyond a German religious conflict into a broader European power struggle. The entry of new nations, innovative generals, and shifting alliances turned the war into one of the most destructive in European history. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more historical deep dives. Don't forget to comment below. Which leader do you think changed the war more, Wallenstein or Gustavus Adolphus?